Okay, so hello everyone. This is Douglas Macbeth here. Welcome to the first of our Google Hangouts. I'm just going to pass around the team in a minute to introduce ourselves, and then we'll deal with some of your questions. So if I can pass over to Tim to introduce himself.
Oh, thank you, Douglas, and great to be back on yet another of the Hangouts on this amazingly popular program. My name is Tim Cummins. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the International Association for Contract and Commercial Management, IACCM, and I'm actually joining the program today from Ottawa in Canada. We're in fact talking at the Telfer School of Business with representatives from industry and government. One of the key themes of that discussion is in fact around the emerging skill requirements to support improved contracting, particularly in complex projects and in both public sector and industry. So Sally, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim. Yes, hello and welcome everybody again. It's lovely to be here with you all. I'm Sally Hughes and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of IACCM. It's my pleasure to be here talking to you all today and also to be fielding questions. So many of you will be putting questions onto Twitter and also onto the YouTube feed. So forgive me because I'm going to be looking sideways from time to time and checking the questions that you're submitting, and that Douglas, Tim and I will do our utmost to answer effectively for you. So today's Google Hangout is about skills. Now, specifically, we're talking about skills in the contract management field, but we felt that it was very important at the same time to be talking about skills that are required generally. And certainly from some of the information that I've been reading recently, and one of the documents that I've read is the Future of Jobs report that came out of the World Economic Forum. And there's some very interesting statistics in there. Not least around the impact of technology and automation. And Tim, I'm going to pose the first question to you because, as you and I both know, this is something that's on the tip of many people's tongues at the moment, the fear around technology and automation and the impact that that's having globally at the moment. So how do we answer the question, will I still have a job?
Yes, Sally. Of course, that is of a bigger concern to you than it perhaps is to Douglas and I. But it is, of course, very, very real as people enter into decisions around their careers and so on. What is it that's going to actually remain valuable to do? Well, I suppose one of the first and foremost skills that we can inevitably point at is that of being adaptive. It's having a mindset and an attitude that welcomes change, welcomes the opportunities that change represents, and is prepared to be perhaps rather more reflective, but also extremely perhaps outward-looking in terms of observation skills, communication skills, the readiness to network and communicate openly and freely, because we are going to need to have, I think, far more insight that we can collect. And now, what else does that mean is important? Certainly analytical skills, I think, will continue to be very important. But perhaps most important is going to be that issue of application of knowledge. And this, I think, would be interesting to get your perspectives on this, Douglas, because one of the things that we've been debating a little bit is there any point any longer in people going to school? Now, you know, the point of that being, of course, that so much knowledge is now becoming available on demand. And the skill set that you need is much more how to apply that knowledge rather than actually in itself knowing things. Yet many of the traditional education systems are perhaps still imposing the requirement for knowledge rather than helping people to understand how to use that knowledge to productive benefit.
I think you're absolutely right, and there is a cultural difference between the East and the West in this. We see it very much in the universities, that there are certain cultures where memory is more important than critical analysis, if you like. But it's not just the access to knowledge, which, you know, the fact that we now have the verb to Google, it's the first thing that most people do, and then it's Wikipedia probably. So you're right, the knowledge is there, or the basic facts are there. Trying to make sense of it is a bigger challenge. And actually, behind all of this, there's an even more fundamental issue, I think, and you've kind of hinted at it. But it's the evaluation process. The academics talk about critical evaluation. It's an easy thing to say. It's a very difficult thing to teach or even to learn. But there's actually, because there's so much information available to most people with Wi-Fi, there's a belief that that is the same as knowledge and understanding, and it's clearly not. So I think one of the biggest challenges is actually to get people ready to challenge everything that they read and hear. But that's actually quite difficult. It's difficult in our universities to teach that. I think it's difficult in many organizations, because as soon as you begin to challenge, you're actually putting some stress onto your supervisors and your managers, because if they're not challenging as well, you're really criticizing them. But unless we do that, unless we can make sense of this enormous exponential growth in so-called knowledge, then we're just simply going to be swamped by it. So there's opportunities, but there's inherent threats in there as well. So I think the challenging mindset is one of the things that Western universities would like to claim that they teach. Whether they succeed all the time in that, I'm not so sure, but that's essentially the logic of why we've got these places. But we need to have that kind of thinking more universally spread. So your question was about schools. My ex-head teacher or primary school wife would tell me she's been doing it for years, teaching children to think in more creative and data-driven ways, really. And I think maybe it's the rest of the institutions up to them, including the universities and many employers, who haven't learned to do what some of our best primary schools have been doing for a while. So absolutely, there's a role for schools at all sorts of different levels. But what goes on inside them could be very, very different.
I think you raised a really good point, Douglas, and there's a couple of things that come up for me in that. And one of the things, again, is a quote from the Davos report that says that nearly 50% of subject knowledge acquired during the first year of a 4-year technical degree will be outdated by the time students graduate. And of course, one of the things that the report concludes with is this need for lifelong learning, that people really need to be committed to continually learning, and which should be eminently possible given the commoditization of knowledge, essentially, that is happening now with Google and Wikipedia, etc. But you touch on being taught how to challenge, and at the IACCM EMEA conference in Rome last week, we touched on that in our keynote panel discussion. And one of the questions was around your ability, or an individual's ability, to make potentially career-limiting decisions, but in the belief that the challenge, of course, is an appropriate challenge. And Tim gave some great examples of moments in his career where he had to make a career-limiting decision, but in fact ultimately it didn't end up being that way. But is that something you can teach people. And I mean, I love what you just discussed with your primary school example, because I think it needs to be ingrained at a very young age, and I think it's a very difficult thing for universities to try and you know, any sort of training program later in life to try and encourage that ability to challenge. Is it something you can teach?
I believe that. I believe so. It certainly helps if you can build it in early enough. Um, but I've had some experience in an MBA class this year, for example, with someone coming from that kind of culture who didn't challenge and had heard all this talk about critical evaluation and just didn't understand it. So going through some processes, some effectively skills training. Um, you know, it's just about looking at things in a different way. So it's part of that wider awareness issue that I think Tim touched on as well. That if there's one thing that I think is going to be true in the future, is that we will not be in the same little employment boxes we were in the past. So if your thinking is constrained by the box or the silo you're already in, then you've got a problem. And I think this is also what Tim was hinting at in his discussion about being adaptive. I think you've got to see different ways of seeing the world, and you've got to think of different ways of organizing yourself and your organization in some way to see new opportunities. I think if we're repeating the mistakes of the past all the time, we must be missing these new opportunities.
So many of the opportunities that occur today are really driven by more innovative commercial policies or practices. If you look at the whole genesis of organizations such as Amazon or Uber, it was because individuals, groups, teams challenged the traditional way of doing things and said, actually, there's a different commercial model that can be created. So if we think about commercial policies and practices and contracting in this context, we're talking here about decisions about the levels of risk that you accept as a business, or what sort of pricing and charging models you want to operate with, or even at the point of what sort of guarantees or warranties do I want to give associated with the quality of my product or service. Those are the sorts of commercial policies and practices. Now, what you will recall, Sally, one CEO of a large company said to us recently was, my commercial and contracts people simply don't offer enough challenge. And he was saying, in such a dynamic, fast-changing world, I would expect to see contracts commercial people in my office on a regular basis proposing changes, highlighting the need for change to particular current commercial policy and practice, because it is out of date. It's frequently needing to adjust to competitive conditions, to the new technologies, to the shifts of economic wealth, or the ups and downs of the geopolitical world. But of course, the second thing is that simply going in and mounting challenge is not okay. As one group of general counsel we were talking with recently, one of them observed, people used to respect my opinion, but now they want facts. And I think that's one of the other big transitions for the professions, that increasingly they're expected to actually have data, not just opinions. And so another of the skill sets is very much around, I think, our readiness and ability to share data, build data, so that we're speaking, and I think it goes to the heart of what Douglas was saying as well, so that we're actually synthesizing, extracting facts from what we propose. This world of contracts and commercial is woefully short of facts. Nobody's really got a clue what impact particular terms and conditions or policies or practices might have on the market. It's very much driven today by opinion. And I think that's going to be one of the massive areas of change. And the third critical point I'd make about this skill set is that going to the business with problems, using our knowledge simply to pose difficulties and say, oh, that's a really bad idea, or we tried that 53 years ago and it didn't work, is not acceptable. So the people who will get esteem and will have career paths are the people who certainly mount challenge, but do it with a factual basis, an analytical basis, if you like, and who are proposing solutions rather than just presenting problems.
Yes, and it's interesting, Tim, because just picking up on exactly what you've just said, um, many of the reports that are coming out at the moment about the skills that are required for the future generally are social skills. So it's skills such as persuasion, emotional intelligence, being able to teach and empower others. So with all of that in mind, and with our knowledge of the fact that these interpersonal skills, creativity, listening, etc., are all so critical and are going to continue to become more and more important in the contract and commercial world and in any profession, how do you acquire those skills? How do we all go about acquiring skills like that?
That's the big issue, isn't it? Because it's partly the individual's motivation to go out and look for those opportunities, but the employing organisation has a huge responsibility as well to make it possible to do that. To recognise that if you're at the leading edge of some areas, there can be failure, and that can't be punished. It must be recognised as part of the learning process. So, going back to Tim's example of the chief exec who was challenging his contracts and commercial people to be more challenging, I would like to ask the question of what kind of environment does he create, or he or she create? Is it easy actually to talk to those kind of people? Are they ready to change themselves and their organisations to make this? So rather than criticising individuals, I think there's a bigger organisational issue. And I think contracts and commercial has suffered from that, like many other professional areas, because it has been seen as too operational. And yet our belief, our experience would suggest that doing this properly is a huge commercial advantage. But how many of our major employers or government agencies or whatever have really taken that on board yet? So until they're ready to be a little bit more open, it's actually quite difficult and potentially dangerous for individuals to make those career-changing decisions if nobody else in the organisation is ready to move along the same kind of path.
Yeah, Tim.
So I think obviously in many ways it's easiest for me to answer your question, Sally, in terms of, I suppose, what are we doing as we look at our community of 40,000 members and try to equip them, because certainly as their representative association, that's absolutely what we see as our duty. But of course, as you well know, we can't force people to make these changes. All we can do is seek to facilitate it. So, I mean, I suppose the prerequisite to the question you're asking is in a sense what Douglas just alluded to, in the openness and readiness of the people themselves to make some changes. But if they do, then I think there are increasing opportunities available to discover what those skills might be and to practice them. And I suppose what we're seeking to do with a lot of our training programs is not only impart knowledge about the underlying methods and techniques, but to populate those with a lot of the research findings that people could actively use to have those conversations in their business. Indeed, they could use that research to mount the challenge.
Absolutely.
But it's equally the practice of that with things like the workshop activities that we try and embed, the case study materials where we challenge people to think differently about how to approach some of those case studies, to understand better what went wrong, why it went wrong, and how it could have been handled differently. and then to practice those skills. So as you well know, in our expert program, for example, we require people not only to undertake a complex case study environment, but then they actually have to present that to an executive level board that won't just critique them, but will also mentor them and give some support to explain what they did really well and what they didn't do so well. So I suppose this world, as all worlds, if we want to be adaptive, if we want to make progress, then we do need the personal courage to actually put ourselves sometimes outside our comfort zone. But what we can do, and what I suggest universities and business schools can do, is give people a safe environment in which they can practice.
Yeah. And Douglas, this sort of then reinforces the question around, do you see the universities of today supporting that practice, as we've talked about with our IACCM certification and with the expectations of our learners, and our expectations on them as well? Do you see a shift now that we're talking so much about the future of the professions, what skills are going to be required in the future? The fact that, according to one individual, 65% of today's primary school children are going to be doing jobs in 20 years' time that don't even exist today, that we don't know about. So, our schools, our business schools, our universities supporting that unknown?
That's a huge question. I think the answer, typical academic answer, is yes and no. There are elements of good practice everywhere. There are areas where the inertia is just as huge as it is in many commercial organizations. So getting curriculum changed, for example, is a big deal. I suppose the people who taught the engineers or the technicians in the first year, and that knowledge is no longer valid, would argue that the thinking process is still valid. So even although the technical capability moves on, the skill set still works. I think that bit is probably true. And of course, you've got different kinds of universities. You've got the ones that are really looking for very, very high level blue sky research. You've got ones that are more grounded at the teaching level. So you've got enormous range. And you've got individual interests as well. I mean, this whole MOOC process has been a huge challenge to a lot of us. And I think more and more of this will also have to change. Building in the practice elements is also an interesting one, because I can remember days in the UK, for example, where it was much more normal to have time in business or industry alongside your degree. That kind of movement's gone away a little bit. We've had to rediscover, if you like, the apprenticeship program in this country, which was much more practically focused and recognised the different kind of attitude, skill set in the people coming in. So I think we have to be more open. We have to challenge our systems just as like everyone else, and have to be more open to doing things in more technologically driven way. I mean, the whole artificial intelligence debate is going to have huge impact on the education system, broadly speaking. So I'm with Tim. It becomes less of a concern for me, given my advancing years, but I watch with great interest from the sides, because we've still got younger population to worry about.
Well, and it's very interesting that you raised the point about apprenticeships, and I think that's an incredibly relevant topic right now. I mean, certainly we've got a number of organisations who are approaching IACCM about that very subject, and again, at the World Economic Forum, they reference the fact that to manage the significant changes and trends that are happening with employment and in professions and jobs in the future, we're going to need to pull skilled talent from a variety of academic backgrounds.
Yeah.
So it's really important for organizations. But I think it's heartening from my perspective to see organizations really embracing the apprenticeship model and encouraging, particularly in the commercial and contract management field, encouraging apprenticeship through that particular skill set. Tim, I don't know whether you have thoughts on that.
Well, yes, naturally, I suppose you and I, Sally, would feel it's a very good idea. But I think it is. I think, you know, I'm sure you've experienced the same point, that the field of contracts and commercial is in many respects quite different from many of the traditional academic subjects, in that academic subjects are typically about specialisms. You know, you are specializing in finance or in engineering or in law or whatever it may be. And as we know from the recent work on the future of the professions, there are many challenges around that level of specialism, because of course the more special it is, the more probability that it can actually be taken over by artificial intelligence, or at least that many of the roles within it will be. One of the unique components about contracts and commercial management is it's actually much more of a synthesizing activity that looks across a wide body of specialisms and tries to make sense of them in a combined form. It tries to look at the conflict that may arise between, for example, what may be financially desirable as opposed to what might be ethically desirable or legal, and tries to ensure that the conclusion, the solution that is reached, is something that is sustainable, manageable, and represents an operationalized capability. That's very different. And many people have traditionally argued that, well, you can only learn to be a contracts or commercial manager sort of through the hard knock school of life. You have to get into business, and after many years you might just about be capable of doing it, because this isn't something you can be taught. And I think you and I both fundamentally disagree with that. We feel it is something that absolutely that can be taught. But back to Douglas's point, it hasn't naturally fitted into the traditional university and business school syllabus, because it cuts across the typical functional direction or, you know, career profession direction that most universities and business schools teach, and where of course there is faculty that avidly protects its field and doesn't really want to cooperate with other faculties. So that's the challenge we face. But I think it's really exciting that we're now looking at potential programs for apprentices where they can actually start to learn this skill, you know, potentially from the age of 18, maybe even 16. I'm not sure at what age stage it's planning to be introduced, but this is, I think, for all the reasons that we've described in this program and in, you know, in the course overall, this is becoming such a business critical capability that having a flow of people, not necessarily specialists of contracts and commercial, but very importantly in many cases just at least having an awareness and appreciation of what it means and why it matters, and what some of the issues that one needs to watch out for. You know, a lot of the issue here is creating greater awareness and taking people from a position where they didn't even know it existed to an appreciation of its importance. You and I were laughing the other day because I'd had a conversation with quite a seasoned project manager, and this will amuse you, Douglas, and he sat in front of me and he was talking about some of the major projects that he'd run in the past, and he said, do you know, I discovered the other day that not every country uses the same legal system as we do in the UK, and that must really make things complicated.
Well, I think that's one of those people who are going to find the changes coming along quite difficult to deal with.
Yeah, Douglas, I think you're right. Yes, it was quite a surprising statement, but I think it does bring us on quite nicely to another element of skills development, which we often talk about and again read about, and that's the increasing frequency of organizations encouraging people to spend time in different departments, playing different roles, and getting a much more holistic view of the business to be more effective in their perhaps more chosen specialized role. And I would argue that was as relevant for a commercial contract manager role to experience those different elements of the organization. I mean, Douglas, do you know that that's happening? Do you have a view on this?
I think it's certainly is happening. It's that kind of on-the-job thinking is very, very fundamentally important, I think. And we've kind of lost our way a little bit about that. My view of the future is that we need to be more interconnected in business terms, but that also suggests that the kind of functional areas inside our commercial organizations, whatever they are, also need to get closer together and build understanding. And just working with people in these kind of ways makes that easier, makes it more likely that it will be successful, because you build understanding as well as knowledge.
So thank you. I've got a few questions here from our audience, and Tim, I'm going to pose the first one to you, which is an interesting one. What universal work ethic skills will be required for successful contract management in the field of doing business globally? So universal work ethic skills required in successful contract management.
It's another big question, but I suppose my initial thought on that is that trade lies at the heart of human progress, and it also lies at the heart of maintaining the growth of the global economy, and indeed harmonious trading relationships lie at the heart of maintaining world peace. So this is a pretty big area of importance, and if you think about the characteristics that are needed for trade to flourish, there has to be a level of honesty and integrity. Now, we're seeing more and more interest in that. I mean, just last week in London, there was the anti-corruption summit, or whatever it was. I forget exactly what they called it, but 50 years ago, even 20 years ago, the scale of bribery and corruption was just something that society accepted. Increasingly, it doesn't. Increasingly, the practices, the quality, the standards of different companies and the performance of their contracts is becoming more and more visible. You see media headlines almost on a daily basis about companies that have failed to honor their commitments. All of these are absolutely at the heart of contracts and commercial management. It's about our ability to test and challenge the organization's capability to deliver on its promises, and ensuring that the promises that we make and the practices that we observe as a business are honest, ethical, and deserving of trust.
Yeah, thank you. We've had another, before we wrap up, another couple of interesting questions which I'd like to pose. The next one, and Douglas, if you want to jump in on this with your thoughts before Tim does, but the question is, will English remain the lingua franca for international contract negotiations, or will future contract managers need to learn other languages to get the most from contracts?
I think the artificial intelligence issue is an interesting point here, because we're getting closer to almost instantaneous translations. So English is just it's an accident of history. However, making the effort to understand other people's language and culture is not just about translations. So my feeling is that you really have to work harder at being much more international and global. having said that, my limited skills at languages prove that I haven't lived up to my own beliefs here. But in the future, if we're really going to be a global organization of some kind, then we've got to work to all people's strengths and abilities and capabilities. But that needs a real understanding and effort by everyone.
And Tim, we're seeing at IACCM obviously a huge movement towards the use of visualization techniques, for example. So, where pictures speak 1,000 words, and all of that. So I wonder whether or not you think that really does have traction now, and whether you think that really is the future.
Well, the future is absolutely about everybody to be effective, to have a good career path. One of our fundamental skills is going to need to be our ability to step into other people's shoes. If you think about the successful businesses of today, they are increasingly about making people's lives easier. We have to really take that on board in the world of contracting and commercial, where unfortunately very often the things that we do make people's lives more difficult. So we know that something like 88% of people, for example, find contracts really difficult to understand. Well, I mean, that's ridiculous, because if they're important, surely we need to create them in a way that people understand. So to your point, it's about stepping back and saying, well, what way do people want things communicated? And increasingly in a digital age, they want a combination of written, audio, and visual format. There is absolutely no reason why contracts can't be turned into audio files or into videos or even into virtual reality, as you and I have been looking at. So this whole issue of simplification and adjusting to the nature of the audience, it isn't a question of one side or the other having to suffer the difficulty of speaking a foreign language. It's also, as Douglas said, recognizing that artificial intelligence will eliminate that need for us to speak an absolute common tongue, and that we can also represent things in a variety of different forms that improve the probability of people understanding it.
Yeah, thank you. So the last question I'm going to ask, and Tim, I shall pose this one to you because it really is for you. Most of us on this course are probably in a role and want qualifications to support our vocational skills, or others may be aspiring contract managers. What educational path would be best? Is there a recognized standard that contract managers should be aspiring to?
I really don't have a view on that, Sally.
Come on now.
Clearly the underpin for IACCM's creation some 17 years ago now was very much because of the challenge of the fact that there was a growing body of contracts and commercial staff, particularly at that time in the large international corporations, that lacked any underpinning body of knowledge. And although they had some level of internal training within their company, it was inconsistent and often not available to people in quite a lot of locations. So fundamental to our existence was firstly the creation of a recognized body of knowledge, and then of course giving people ready and easy access to it. So as you well know, we've had thousands of people now going through our various training programs and gaining a formal certification. And in many cases, of course, that's individuals who decide to make that investment, but in many others, it's the corporations or the government entities themselves that have decided they need to build that consistency. They need to build more consistent capability, practices and approaches and methods across their workforce. So whether this is for people who truly want to develop as a career path, or whether it's for people who just have more of a need to know, we've made sure that that portfolio of programs is available to them. I don't think there's anybody else who's doing this in such a holistic way. There are obviously specialist or more specialist programs, for example, the National Contract Management Association in the US, which is very much focused on the federal government contracting environment. And of course, there are a number of procurement associations that have bolt-on programs, but they don't lead to any qualification as it relates to contracts or commercial management, and are typically much more focused on just really the post-award environment. So of course there are other options available, but I think we can confidently say that the one that is getting global recognition for anybody certainly who wants to seriously look at this as a career path, that's what IACCM is about.
Thank you. And yes, and as we've said, absolutely, we look at IACCM looks at this as very much a journey to go on, and in line with, fortuitously, with the report that came out of the Economic Forum. We view this very much as lifelong learning, and it's having that dedication and commitment to continuous self-development. So I would encourage you all to go and have a look at the IACCM training program, of course. And again, as we've touched on over the course of the last 45 minutes, that these skills are not necessarily skills for specialists and skills that only would apply to people who want to work in commercial and contract management. We view them very much as skills that would be applicable at a general level. So with that, I'm going to thank you all very much for listening today. Thank you, Tim and Douglas, for participating in this discussion. I would thoroughly recommend everybody to have a read of that Future of Jobs document that came out of the World Economic Forum. It is available on the IACCM website if you want to go and have a look at it. And obviously there are any other number of publications, including The Future of the Professions by the Suskins, and also The Industries of the Future by Alec Ross. So they're all very, very interesting publications that give you even more insight and on a broader level than just the commercial and contract management space. But with that, thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.